Welcome to the Right to Reason podcast. I am your host, Robert Stanley. We are talking to psychologist Dr. Valerie Tarico about her recent article, An Excess of Woke Thinking May Harm Mental Health or Relationships.
And it's been the ruin of many a poor boy.
Let's go.
And God, I know I'm one.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
Hi, this is Valerie Tarico, psychologist and author at valerietarico.com, and you are listening to the Right to Reason podcast.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
Valerie Tarico is a psychologist and writer in Seattle, Washington. She is the author of Trusting Doubt, a former evangelical looks at old beliefs in a new light. Ideas and Other Imaginings. Her articles about religion, reproductive health, and the role of women in society have been featured at sites including, this is amazing, The Huffington Post, Salon, The Independent, Quillette. Did I say that right? Quillette?
Quillette, I think.
Quillette. Oh my God. Free Inquiry, The Humanist Alternate, Raw Story, Grist, Jezebel, and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. You can subscribe at valerietarico.com. That's VALERIETARICO.com. Or if you want to make it easy on yourself, just click the link in today's show notes. Dr. V, I'm so happy to be talking to you.
It's good to be back on the show. Thank you for inviting me again.
Absolutely. You just wrote a very controversial article. Every time you come on, there's another controversial article you wrote. And just for the listener's sake, you should know, the last two times she was on, she was discussing woke stuff. But you guys should know, Valerie Tarico has been on this broadcast multiple times. Most of the time she comes on is defending abortion and women's rights. In fact, I kind of wanted to ask you about this. You did an article before we get to an excess of woke thinking may harm mental health or relationships. That's the point of today's discussion. But you also did an article, Why I'm No Longer Worried About Losing Roe. I read that. I started off thinking, you're crazy. And halfway through, I didn't have to get to the end. Halfway through, I'm like, once again, she's making very valid points. Can you reference that for real quick, and then I want to get into this discussion.
You know, the reason I wrote that article, Why I'm No Longer Worried About Roe, to be honest, I don't want to minimize the cost of us losing federal abortion protections, because it will definitely affect people, women in red states in particular, and the most vulnerable women more so than other people, right? But the reality is that there are two ways to reduce unmet need for abortion. One is to increase access to abortion, and the other is to reduce need. And we've been making a lot of progress on that. So abortions have actually been in decline on a per capita basis since the 1990s. And part of that has to do with the fact that we are doing a better job of educating people about how to prevent mistimed and unwanted pregnancies. And part of it has to do with the fact that contraceptive technologies have improved significantly. So state-of-the-art IUDs and implants take those first trimester abortions that are a consequence of unsought surprise pregnancy and can reduce them to near zero. On the pill, 1 in 10 women gets pregnant on an annual basis. If a couple is relying on condoms, it's even higher than that. And with a state-of-the-art IUD or implant, that rate of unsought pregnancy drops below 1 in 500. So you could think about that as like 1 in 500 women who are relying on those methods gets pregnant. You could also think about it that you'd have to be using one of those methods for 500 years. If you used it for 500 years, you'd experience one unsought pregnancy, right? So there's a lot of ways that people are going to be able to continue improving and reducing the unmet need for abortion. And then the second thing is that with abortion medications, actually, we now are able to get those two women via telemedicine services. There's this awesome organization called Aid Access that will connect women with a doctor in another country, and then the abortion pills come directly to them from the manufacturer in India. So you've got that organization providing oversight, connections, and quality control so that people can do self-managed abortion at home in states where otherwise those services would not be available. And honestly, they're a lot cheaper. So you go into a clinic for an early first trimester medication abortion, and it's going to cost probably $600 or more. And with the pills online, it can be as low as $110.
Fascinating. I got to tell you, Valerie, I have been really worried about Roe versus Wade, and after reading your article, I got a little bit of a new perspective. Not that the topic itself isn't important, but maybe we're misunderstanding it in its entirety. And I think that's kind of what your article on the excess of woke thinking might have been referencing. You said this, and I want to quote you here and then play you a clip and get your opinion on it. The clip is from Black Guns Matter, Why Woke is Good. But first, you said, wokeism, as I am discussing it here, is a derivative blend of ideology and pop culture amplified by social media. It sorts people into tribes of oppressed and oppressors, assigning each of us an identity based on our intersecting memberships in groups with race and sex at the forefront. That's your definition of wokeism. Let me play you this and get your opinion.
I was watching The Matrix 4, and it was a very important part of the movie. I think the movie was trash, but I pulled some things from it. One, it spoke to how even this great thing like the movie The Matrix, which was a thing that a lot of people found something enlightening by, right? The Matrix will use that for its own uses, right? To its own advantage. And that's key. And that I say that to say, when we have this concept or conversation around the concept or term called woke, it's a perfect example of that. You hear people saying, go woke, go broke, everything woke turns to shit. That is the exact opposite of the original meaning and actual meaning or use of the word woke. When you had somebody that was asleep or sleepwalking or the walking dead, that means they weren't aware of what's going on outside. They're doing all of the functional things to be alive, but they're not really woke. They still plugged in, they still asleep in the matrix. When you woke, you're aware of the subliminal manipulation. You're aware of the overt manipulation. You're aware that there is an approach to make you stay asleep. But again, in true Matrix fashion, now we have people saying, oh, you so woke, you extra woke, you need to go to sleep.
All right, so I do want to say to that point, he did follow that up by saying people that are being extra sensitive are misunderstanding what the woke movement is. They are actually fake woke. But to that definition, I feel like a lot of your readers might take whenever you say woke as a negative, they might think that you're attacking people that just stand up for disenfranchised members of society, that you're not necessarily speaking up for racism or anti-LGBTQ rights, ableism, what have you. Is that what you mean by woke?
So let me say for starters that there is no right vocabulary here. No matter what vocabulary we use to talk about these social dynamics and trends, the vocabulary is fraught. Using the word woke, one way that it's fraught, for example, is that the word woke originated in the Black community as Black slang, right? And it referred to kind of people being vigilant or aware of subtle forms of racism or systemic racism in the world around them. And then it became this point of pride, got adopted broadly by a whole bunch of folks on the left, including white people. And then over time, as the excesses of what I'm describing as wokeism kind of came to the front, it became used more as a pejorative term. You know, so that's why I went to such trouble to say, here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the specific cultural nexus that is a derivative blend of critical theory and kind of like certain kinds of anti-racist thinking and pop culture and kind of social media that I think has some toxic dimensions to it. And I recognize, of course, that there's this kind of uncomfortable dynamic around kind of, some people would say, well, is it even cultural appropriation for people broadly on the left to be using this term woke, and especially to be using it in a pejorative term, given that it emerged from Black culture. And I'm perfectly happy, I guess, I'm comfortable with that. I'm comfortable with that because I actually have a lot of problems with the harm inflation that has been part of our conversation about cultural appropriation. I think that what all cultures are made of is bits and pieces that are borrowed and reworked and synthesized and integrated from other cultures. So to kind of try to somehow say that process is illegitimate, I think illegitimizes cultural evolution itself.
Yeah, in fact, even that quote I used, you said, it sorts people into tribes of oppressed and oppressors. I remember I'm currently working on my master's in criminal justice, and I wrote a paper and I used that word tribes. And when you said cultural appropriation, it brought this memory back. My instructor really gave me a hard time. She said, tribes, that word tribes, that references Native Americans, and that's cultural appropriation. And at first, I'll be honest with you, I felt a little ashamed, like I said something I didn't know. I said the wrong thing, like it's like when I hear my wife and her friends talking, and they're like, bitch, let me tell you what happened. And, like, it's the same way, like, I look at my wife and I'm like, bitch, you need to do the dishes. Like, that's a different bitch. You know what I mean? Like, that's a different usage. And if she said, you don't get to talk, like, you don't get to say that, like, I would immediately feel something where I'm like, oh, well, I was trying to be funny like you and your friends, or what have you. In that moment, like, I felt that bit of shame. And then I thought about it. I grew up in Sunday school, and I remember hearing the word, the tribes of Judah, referencing the Old Testament Jews, right? And I started thinking, like, well, tribes have been referenced long before Native Americans. Maybe this cultural appropriation is such a complex network. It's like a spider web, but three-dimensional. How do you recognize which cultural theme had the first claim as we're all kind of pulling from one another?
Well, the word, tribal structures, kind of as described by anthropologists, and the reason that we use that word to describe Native American kin groups, right, is it's something that is a universal human phenomenon. You go back far enough, and all of our ancestors lived in kin groups or clusters that we would now call tribes. Again, I use the term harm inflation around cultural appropriation is that you have people who are almost competing to show how hyper aware they are of racism or hyper aware they are of power structures. And so they want to catch anything that could possibly implicate you in some form of ignorance or racism. And it's in a bunch of ways, it's pretty insular. It's kind of got I think, a navel-gazing aspect to it, in that it completely chooses to ignore the breadth of human history to focus on internal, intra-human dynamics, specifically within our culture and our history here in the United States most of the time.
What I loved is you broke down the difference between woke social justice approach and evidence-based therapy approach, and showed how these things are in conflict. For example, in referencing people's emotions and reasoning, the SJW might say feelings are reality. If a member of I'm quoting here, member of a traditionally oppressed tribe, someone female, queer, disabled, or Black, for example, feels violated, they have been violated. If they feel threatened, they must be protected. If a member of a traditionally powerful tribe feels ashamed, they should. We shouldn't question another person's feelings if they are from a traditionally oppressed tribe. However, evidence-based therapy says, I am not my feelings. My feelings are one indicator of what is real and important. I like that you said that too, by the way. I appreciate that. But you also followed, they are worthy of attention, but they can be wrong or simply out of proportion. But can you comment more to just some issues between the social justice approach to understanding your emotions and what therapy teaches us?
Well, so the reason I wrote, you know that I have been critical of woke approaches to social justice. I think that more broadly, that I wrote an article a while back called The Righteous and the Woke, Why Social Justice Warriors and Evangelicals Trigger Me in the Same Way.
I loved it.
I've written about kind of the social liberal democratic tradition that is kind of grounded morally and philosophically in human universalism versus the kind of the more differentiated approach that kind of centers us in our tribal identities. But in this article, I specifically was realizing that as this subculture of wokeism in the community that I'm a part of has become ascendant, that what we see is that there are aspects of that culture that specifically run counter to what I know about mental health as a kind of now retired psychotherapist and what we know about healthy relationships, right? So when you think about some of the fact that it is dichotomizing, that it's about all or nothing thinking, when you kind of think about the fact that woke subcultures tend to people are kind of looking to catch each other out or looking to kind of make the worst possible interpretation of what someone else has said, as opposed to giving them the benefit of the doubt, looking for points of agreement, et cetera. Or in this specific case, what we're talking about is the way that wokeism tends to think about emotions and reason. And so, yes, that there is this sense in at least some woke subcultures that if I'm feeling wounded, then I have been wounded, and there's no that everybody needs to then orient their responses around the fact that I have this feeling. You know, the reason that wokeism, there are several reasons that wokeism elevates emotion above reason or rationality. One is that it, you know, kind of reason and rationality are seen in some postmodernist approaches to feminism and to racism as white Eurocentric male ways of knowing, epistemologies that kind of don't apply equally to other cultures or to less formally educated groups of people. So they're kind of trying to say, well, our feelings are equally accessible to all of us. And so if you elevate the significance of feelings, then you're creating an equalizing function there. And I think all of us then, if you look at kind of the trajectory of mental health over the course of the last, how would I say it? Well, certainly since I've been an adult, that there's this sense of that what our self-help groups and our mental health processes are often trying to get people to do is to trust their feelings, to articulate their feelings, and to use I statements, because if you're talking about your feelings, nobody can question you. Whereas if you just make statements of fact, people can question or misinterpret or reject whatever accusation you're making. So there is this. Within the woke social justice approach, then there is this centering in on let's make feelings the metric by which we measure other things.
You mentioned identity. I wanted to focus on that. One thing you said is woke social justice theory downplays individuality. Instead, it emphasizes continuity of group identity. Treating individuals as proxies for victims or victimizers, past and present, this collective or tribal identity often gets elevated above individual values, behaviors, or life history. Identity isn't what you have done, it is how you were born. I want to play this response to how the woke media undermines democracy, and then I want to come back to your opinions on woke identity. Batya Ungar-Sargon, the deputy opinion editor of Newsweek, said this at a Berkeley School of Law discussion.
So how do you recommend that people help redirect the conversation?
Make relationships with people you disagree with. That's a whole game. Be part of the army that is stitching back together the fabric of American society, and that is how you do that. Remember what it means and how it feels to respect somebody whose views make you angry. You know, every time you're on your phone or you're on your computer and you're scrolling through social and you see something that makes you feel enraged, you know that feeling that's like road rage, like, oh, I can't believe this person believes this, I have to write something on Twitter. Every time you feel that rage, someone is making $1 million. I'm being totally serious, like totally literally, like it is not normal to feel that way about a stranger. And we feel that way because very, very smart people who are much smarter than you or I, have figured out how to make us feel that way about people we've never met, about our fellow Americans. And it's wrong. And you can be a person who trains yourself how not to feel that way by going to shul, by going to church, by going to volunteer, by finding spaces that are not political in your life, and making relationships with people that are not based on political agreement, and remembering what it feels like to be a Democrat, small d, to respect the views of somebody you disagree with. That's the only, because the sad thing is that this media stuff, it's really profitable, and I just don't see it turning around. We consume too much media. We know too much stuff. You don't need to know who AOC is angry at every single day. We don't need to know that. We know that because people are getting rich off of telling us that, but you can decide not to need to know that. It's not, you want to know what's going on in your community, go find out what's happening in your community. That's just, it's not satisfying, but that's all I got.
My daughter is 16 and she loves fine arts, but she has a very woke fine arts instructor. I hear her talking about things like what was just being referenced right there, where I think you're getting your media from social media. You saw a TikTok video that told you this or that, and that's not the whole story. One example is we're at Walmart and she sees a friend from her school and she immediately hides behind me. Now, this is a very socialized 16-year-old girl. She is hilarious. She's very good in social scenarios. I've seen her talk to adults without fear, which, if you have kids, that's actually not a small feat for teenagers. They acquire that skill over time. I've seen her talk to groups of students. I've seen her have one-on-one conversations with other kids. She can talk to me about logic and philosophy and religion and politics. This girl's good, right? She's got skills socially. But as soon as she sees a student from her class, she hides behind me. And I say, what are you doing? She's like, oh, I'm just scared to be around, seeing kids in public from school. And then I noticed it on social media and it hit me. They're being told to think this way. You and I, Valerie, we didn't grow up with that bullshit. Nobody's ever had an issue with seeing someone from school in public. We would have grown up and been like, hey, how you doing? Oh my God, But they were told this because it was like a meme or something cool. The message that we just got there was something of positivity, and what media does in reference to identity is try to tell us what our identity is because it makes money.
Yeah. What you're talking about is trying to kind of find ways, and what Batya was talking about, right, is that when you look at what's going on here, one of my biggest concerns about wokeism as an approach to social justice, there are alternate approaches to social justice, to kind of creating more equity and to creating more opportunity and creating more human flourishing in our societies. But one of the kind of concerns with this one is that it is inherently divisive, right? It is not about centering in our shared humanity. It is about centering in our group identities. And so I had a wonderful client years back when I had a psychotherapy practice he had read something that stuck in my head, which was that in some ways I am like all other people. In some ways, I'm like some other people, and in some ways, I'm like no other person. And so when you think about that, when you think about the Enlightenment and about humanism, or about kind of universalism as a basis, our kind of shared humanity as a basis for social justice, we're talking about the first of those and the third of those. In some ways, I am like all other people, right? Recognizing our shared experience, not only with human beings, but also with other sentient beings, even perhaps, from a moral standpoint. In some ways, I'm like some other people. That's the tribal dimension of it. And then or at least that's where the tribal dimension falls. And in some ways, I'm like no other person. It's about our unique individuality. And the Enlightenment and approaches to social democracy that were ascendant clear through the civil rights movement really centered on the first of those. Like, we're all in this together and we are each unique individuals. We each need to be able as individuals to rise to the level of our capacities to kind of pursue our individuality and to be able to flourish in that way. And like human history largely up to the point of the Enlightenment was much more centered on shared tribal identity. And then I think we kind of had this course correction coming back to tribal identity, again, partly because there are some aspects of that legitimately are powerful determinants of human flourishing that we hadn't been talking about. But then once again, we did this real kind of, I think, overcorrection, pendulum swing right back into the way that human beings have lived forever, except that what woke people are trying to do is simply invert those pecking orders by changing which tribes are at the top. So let me come back to kind of talk about one other thing. You quoted Batya and her perception that what we need to do is to, if we want to challenge the deep divisions in our society and the way that both the left and right are feeding tribal identity and defensiveness and conflict is that we need to kind of put ourselves out there to be with people who may be different from us, who may think differently than us, whose politics may be different from ours. And rather than assuming that they are inherently bad human beings, to go at that with a little bit of humility. So there's a wonderful little book that was written by a guy named Jim Henderson, who is a Seattle pastor. You know me to be a former evangelical. I don't quote pastors very often, but I love Jim, and I love he wrote a little book with a colleague of his that was called Crossing the Difference Divide, and it contains these 3 practices that I think are kind of, if you want to do what Batya was suggesting, these practices are so powerful that they've actually stuck in my head ever since I read his little 100-page book, even though my memory is crap. So the first one of those 3 practices is, I will be unusually interested in others. The second one is, I'll stay in the room with difference. And the third one is, I'll stop comparing my best with your worst. And I think that's what it is. I think that those 3 practices are powerful at the individual level. I also think they are very powerful at the level of how do we think about other people in terms of their tribal identity, right? So I, on the left, what would happen if I stopped comparing the best of my tribe with the worst of the Trump-loving tribe?
Well, that reference kind of flattened me, to be honest. Now I want to get to, right at the end, you referenced Judaism, critical race theory, and neo-Marxism. I want to ask you about that. But to finish up the topic on identity, which I loved how you said this, you were once again comparing woke philosophy with actual clinical psychology. The woke ideology says people who have victim identity shouldn't be seen as victimizers even when they destroy property or harm others. Lashing out at members of oppressor tribes is justified, righteous, punching up. Collective guilt means this is true even if the oppressor is individually less powerful than the oppressed. But evidence-based therapy says people who harm others very often have experienced similar harms themselves. Often the goal of therapy is to break the cycle. Being a victim doesn't prevent you from victimizing others. Once again, referencing my daughter, that's something I talk to her about all the time. Hurt people. And at the same time, where I appreciate where you're saying that doesn't mean that you aren't hurting people. I wonder if in your article, maybe you're leaving out some empathy for people that have been hurt.
Well, perhaps because, that's possible, because what I was trying to say is kind of look at, we've got a problem here if we're kind of centering people in a victim identity to the point that we undervalue their strengths, their capacity for resilience, their capacity for healing, or if we ignore their capacity for doing harm. But I think, and clearly for, as a therapist, I would say that if you want to be able to help someone move beyond a victim identity, that you have to first be able to kind of hear the depth of their pain and to kind of for them to be seen, for them to be recognized. I think the problem comes when we fail to recognize that we also have the capacity to not just recognize other people's pain, but to actually amplify it and crystallize it.
All right. So to the big question I was wanting to ask you, you said at the end of your article, just as Christianity has roots in Judaism, which has roots in earlier pagan religions, wokeism does have roots in academic critical theory, which in turn has roots in, yes, neo-Marxist Frankfurt School of Philosophy, but it is neither of these things. Dr. Tarico, I am sick and tired of the right. I love when you and I kick at the left because they need it. They should know better. You know what I mean? I don't hold the right to the same standard because I feel like they're honest about their fucking bullshit, But I'm so tired of them just saying everything's Marxism, everything's critical race theory. Can you comment to that? Because I see your point. It might have roots in it, but I don't know. I fear this just gives them too much leverage.
Well, that is the problem with us being so polarized, right? Is that that critiques of one side or the other become quickly amplified by outsiders, and then it makes self-reflection almost impossible. So
Yes.
when we feel so threatened from the outside, then we are unable to look at ourselves and to examine what might be the inconsistencies, imperfections, the flaws, or the harm that we're doing. So again, coming back to my experience as a therapist, that's one of the reasons therapy is effective, is because what you're doing is you're creating a safe space where there's no one there who's going to be on the attack. And yet what happens with this degree of polarization that we have is that it becomes almost impossible to have a self-reflective conversation. So I wrote this, I got accused of being a boomer, of being a Karen, of being kind of, right-winger. John McWhorter, who also has written sometimes very eloquently about these issues, and not perfectly, but he gets assumed to be right of center constantly. It's in a kind of context in which people feel threatened, it becomes a matter of tribal loyalty to not say anything bad about your own tribe. But how can we grow if we don't?
Right. That's my biggest issue. Is it's almost like we're not allowed to say certain things now. And, the woke will respond, well, you can say them, but you will face consequences. Well, fuck you. Your consequences are limiting the message. And I would like to hear from people I disagree with, because before I became an atheist, for example, I heard things that didn't necessarily, in the old school debate fashion, it didn't change my mind. It just gave me the fucking chance to ask the question. It gave me the chance to consider the question, to have options. Mm-hmm. It gave me options. If we limit free speech, if we tell people you're not allowed to talk about this because of your identity, well, a lot of people with the identity that you don't agree with aren't going to get to have options. They're not going to get to ask questions. They're not going to have the freedom to change their mind. It's not just about changing minds or control of speech or thought. It's about just presenting it. And I know liberals mock this, but in the marketplace of ideas, I still believe in that, Valerie. I still think there's value there, even in 2022.
Yeah. I think that I have a ton of, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, that I have a ton of respect for people like McWhorter, who is left of center, who says he's never voted Republican, I think, in his life, but who is calling out the kind of anti-racist aspect of wokeism and saying that he finds it infantilizing of Black people, that we're kind of like the implication on the left that we have to remove kind of testing standards, that we have to change math, that like the idea that somehow we can't count on, we can't ask Black people to be rational, et cetera. As a Black man, he's calling all of that out in terms of that dimension of kind of that problem, those problematic aspects of wokeism as an approach to social justice. Batya, who is a socialist, right, is calling out, I think, the fact that wokeism and a bunch of the right-wing ideologies right now are both essentially these elitist ideas that ignore class to a large degree and ignore the kind of practical work of making of lifting up people's lives and creating opportunity for folks who are otherwise struggling and who may kind of be, in fact, still struggling because of the cascading intergenerational effects of racism, especially the descendants of African slaves, right? So you've got those people coming at it, critiquing it from that standpoint. I'm critiquing it in my article, An Excess of Woke Thinking May Harm Mental Health or Relationships, from the standpoint, from a different standpoint, which is the standpoint of what do we know about what constitutes healthy relationship functioning, whether it's at the individual level and kind of healthy cognitive functioning, healthy emotional functioning, or whether it's kind of a broader group that we're functioning in, like with a set of colleagues or with a kind of other people who are in community with us, right? And that's where the black-white thinking of wokeism, the tribal identity aspect of it, the elevation of emotions over reason and self-reflection, those kinds of the kind of eschewing of conflict and disagreement, the need to label anyone who disagrees with us as morally bankrupt. That's what I was trying to focus on in this article, because I think that there's a high cost. Jonathan Haidt talked about this also in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, but that there's a cost from a psychological health standpoint for people who buy in too deep into these patterns or habits of an engagement.
I like that you brought up disagreement. That was a major part of your article that one hit home for me on conflict and disagreement, because that's what I do on the broadcast, The Right to Reason. It's like we discuss conflict and we disagree. And I had an interview with, and I bring this up. Let me preface this. I have nothing against this guy, but he did say something that, it's in that woke theme, and I didn't like it. Honestly, Valerie, it pissed me the fuck off. I was talking to David G. McAfee. He's an atheist author. I'm sure you've heard of him. Probably read a lot of his stuff. I enjoy his work. I enjoy his activism. And, once again, let me, beating a dead horse here, but like, this isn't me talking shit about the guy. It's just at one point, and I edited this whole part out because this whole thing wasn't about he and I debating about Islam. It was about trying to present his recent book, which is Hi, I'm an Atheist, by the way. But I edited the whole thing out, but the conversation nobody ever heard, which I'll tell you and the listeners right now, is we were talking about his references to Islam throughout his book. And whether you agree with this point or not, I think you would agree with the problem with how he handled disagreement. But I was saying, like, hey, you kept referencing Islam and Christianity like in the same venue, like they're equal in violence. And maybe historically we could make arguments either way, like Christianity could have been worse historically. I don't know. But like right now, I don't necessarily think that's fair. And he went after, he started saying, well, think about all the right-wing white supremacist Trump supporter people. Like there's all these attacks going on. And I gave him that. I said, that's right. Even if we're not going back to 2001, when 9/11 time, which is 3,000 dead from Islamic terrorism. Nobody's touching those numbers, even in 2021. But regardless, even if we don't, if we start at 2002 and go to now, there's been a lot of right-wing stuff, more than Islamic stuff in the U.S. But my point was the death counts. We still can't compete with Islamic extremism death counts. The American people that are right-wing still aren't doing that to the same degree that the other group is, right? Like it's insane. And that would, whether you agree with that, I'm not trying to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm just saying his response to that was, I disagree. Check out the FBI statistics. If you look into it, you'll know what I know. And it was a little condescending, and that's fine. But then I said, all right, we're trying to talk about your book today. Let's agree to disagree. And he said, no, I will not. And that hit me because I talked to a lot of right-wing people. I talked to a lot of Christian apologists, Islamic apologists, conspiracy theory people. I don't typically hear that from their ilk, but I hear it all the time from our side, the liberal side.
Yeah, it's and there's these ridiculous memes that go around like agreeing to disagree is about things like whether chocolate or vanilla ice cream tastes better. Like that's hogwash, right? I mean, there is such a lack of humility in that perspective, such a lack of recognition of the complexity and nuance and multidimensionality of our society and culture. But we've gotten there has been a concerted effort over the course of the last few years to stigmatize disagreement, to kind of that there's such a righteousness about wokeism, right? That if you disagree, it's not that there's any room for kind of different people to have different hypotheses about how we get to a better future that most of us are invested in. It's that you are a literal Nazi or you are a racist, which these days is akin to being called a pedophile or whatever, right? I mean, it works very effectively as a kind of way of silencing people and saying they don't deserve respect, they don't deserve to have their opinions heard, because we all largely across the political spectrum are in agreement that racism is a bad thing. And so that attitude that got expressed in that interaction, I think, is broadly, unfortunately, endemic among political activists on the left. And I think it's profoundly arrogant. And it reminds me of Christianity in the sense of it collapse. It has the same arrogance as Christianity, for one thing, right? Like there's only one way to get to heaven, right, through Jesus. And I just happen to be born or happen to kind of be a member of the one right denomination within the one right faith. So it shares that Christian arrogance. It also shares the sort of sanctimoniousness of it and the righteousness of it that kind of leads to purges and inquisitions and that kind of thing. And so it's always dismaying to me when people who have wrestled free of Christianity find themselves then adopting these very Christianist kinds of attitudes. I mean, another way that this is like Christianity is it collapses all sins, right? So like you deserve to go to hell because you had a sexual fantasy about your neighbor's wife, which is kind of somehow equally deserving of eternal torture as if you kind of, violated her and then like set the house on fire. Maybe it's not an accident that kind of what we see is this kind of approach to social justice coming out of a largely Christian and Christianist culture at a time when Christianity is waning.
The article we've been referencing is An Excess of Woke Thinking May Harm Mental Health or Relationships, written by Valerie Tarico at valerietarico.com. Dr. Tarico, you ended this by saying, I think we can do better. I don't know another way to ask it, but how can we?
I think there's a lot of, just as there were within the church, when you and I kind of were members of the church, there's a lot of people who are actually very capable of complex thinking, of kind of thinking about hierarchies of harms, recognizing that those differences are consequential. There are people who are capable of staying in the room with difference, of kind of being able to recognize that we can have multiple competing sometimes values around and hypotheses around how we get to a better future. There are people who are capable of humility, and kind of you and I saw as Christians those things getting steamrolled by the ideology of Christianity itself. And yet I think so. And yet there are within Christianity churches, outside of Christianity, atheist groups that kind of invite people back into those aspects of their better selves. And I hope that what we're trying to do in a conversation like this one is also kind of to think about people who are at least teetering on the edges of what I called excessive wokeism, to be able to look at the potential harms there, to recognize the potentials for arrogance there, to recognize the potential for entrapping people in a kind of victim identity or being demeaning towards them. I do think there's lots of ways that we can do better. And I think part of what we want to do is to, as I said, I think kind of that to some degree this focus on elevating our tribal identities flips us back into what has been the main current of human history, and that it was only after a very long multimillennial struggle that we were able to kind of center our shared humanity and unique individualism. And I think that part of what we need to do is call people back into that. I find it ironic that at this point there are some folks in the center left who seem more capable of doing that than the folks who claim to be the, kind of the champions of elevating people who have traditionally been struggling.
Seattle psychologist and writer Valerie Tarico, author of An Excess of Woke Thinking May Harm Mental Health or Relationships. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I love every time you come on. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. V. Thank you to Dave Blair at DaveBlairMusic.com. Thank you to Feedspot.com for promoting the Right to Reason to the Top 10 Atheist Podcast. Thank you to our patrons, Rob Schreck, Larry Wilson, Michael Moore, Catherine Class, Free Thinker 215, Phil Calderon, Brittany Catherman, Alan Marks, Philip Spawn, Bernard Lamberell, Anima Man, Seek Atheist, Holger Traeger, and our top supporter, Rob Montgomery. You can support this broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we'll hear from comedians Andrew Hall, Michael Regilio, Brent Lee, and Javier about the problems of stealing jokes in stand-up comedy. I'll play clips of some of our favorite stand-ups and then prove to you that they stole them from someone else. Between now and then, fight for your right to reason.